Press's prestigious biennial award for his biography of his grandfather, Gandhi, the Man, His People, and the Empire. His latest publication is titled Modern South India, A History from the 17th Century to Our Times. Rajmohan splits his time between India and the US, working with initiatives of change when in India, and has also served on the Indian Senate. He is a research professor at the University of Illinois, and I'm just so grateful that you're here, Rajmohan. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello to everyone.
Please also welcome Erica Chenoweth, a professor in human rights and international affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Erica has written a number of books, changing the perceptions around the efficacy and long-term effects of nonviolent resistance. Erica's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, won the 2012 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award. Erica's next book with Zoe Marks explored the impact of women's participation on the outcomes of mass movements. Erica's latest book, Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, explores what civil resistance is, how it works, and why it sometimes fails. Erica directs the Nonviolent Action Lab at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, studying political violence and its alternatives. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you. So delighted to be here.
Thrilled. Please also welcome Clayborn Carson. At 19 years old, Clayborn listened to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. He is an author, a biographer, and historian, and is the founding director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. His writings include In Struggle, SNCC and the Black Awakening of the 1960s, and Malcolm X, the FBI File. In the 1980s, Coretta Scott King invited Clayborn to edit all of King's speeches, sermons, correspondence, publications, and unpublished writings, and the King Papers Project was born. We now have 7 volumes of the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. published. We're so glad you're with us tonight, Clayborn.
Good to be with you.
And for Nonviolence, which provides educational resources on the safe and effective use of nonviolence. He has lived at the Blue Mountain Center of Meditation as a student of Eknath Easwaran since 1970. Michael says, it's not about putting the right person in power, but about awakening the right kind of power in people. Thank you so much for bringing us all together tonight, Michael.
Thank you, Anna, and what a great pleasure to be here with all of you.
So I'd like to start by asking Rajmohan if you wouldn't mind beginning with a look back at what Gandhi brought to this movement. What lessons are most relevant to today's struggle?
Of course, Gandhi, I think, showed in his life and through his struggles that nonviolence was a living force. It was not something confined to a sacred book or to a book of history or to a museum, but it was something that could be expressed on our streets, in our interactions with power centers, with other people in society. So nonviolence could be a force, could be a living force. And of course, it had to be a fighting force, something that fights for justice, for rights, for equality. Also, I think Gandhi showed that nonviolence could be an inclusive force, where even the adversary, although strongly opposed for his or her policies, or his or her regime's policies, the adversary could still be included in one's circle of concern. So Gandhi, I think, showed, this was a long time ago, and others have reiterated that example, that nonviolence is a living force, an active force, an inclusive force. So I think I'll stop with that.
Thank you. Clayborn, I wonder if we could turn to you with the question about how SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Martin Luther King Jr. brought Gandhi's wisdom to play in America's civil rights movement. And in light of that, how do you think current movements, especially the Black Lives Matter movement, need to evolve right now?
Well, one of the things they did is they went to India. They contacted Gandhi. They got it from the source. It wasn't something, although one of the things about Gandhian ideas and the movement is that it was featured in Black newspapers during the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, because they were encouraged by, here was another victim of white domination, imperialism, and Gandhi was leading a movement that was having an impact. It was giving them hope. So W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, he wrote to Gandhi, and Gandhi was kind enough to reply, and it was published in the Crisis magazine during the 1920s. There was enough interest that there was an ashram in Harlem. By 1936, a delegation of Black leaders goes to India. And in 1936, going to India was not the simplest thing to do in the world. They had to mobilize all of their resources to get there. They met. And one of the things I would point out is that they didn't go uncritically. They asked pointed questions. What would you do about Southern racism? What would you do if a member of your family was lynched? How do you train people to use nonviolence? I got to know one of the people who went on this, Sue Bailey Thurman, the wife of Howard Thurman. I remember talking with her, and she asked probably the most pointed question about the lynching. What would you do? And they weren't always satisfied with Gandhi's answer. She wasn't satisfied with it. But nonetheless, they felt, here is hope. And one of the people I would mention who just passed away, James Lawson, was extremely important in this because he went to India in the early 1950s, came back to the United States, a Black minister. Well, at that time, he was a divinity student. Martin Luther King was among those who encouraged him to come to the South and go to Nashville, and began a workshop on nonviolent techniques and practices, and the impact of Gandhi was felt directly by some of the students who took the leading role in the sit-ins and the freedom rides of the 1960s. And they were implementing in the United States some of these same ideas. And I think that when we look at what I call the Black Gandhians, I think they took Gandhi's ideas to a new level of visibility, because the American civil rights struggle of the 1960s was highly publicized throughout the world. And it did have an impact. We've mentioned Nelson Mandela. When he comes from prison after all those years he spent in prison, and he becomes able to come to the United States, he arrives in Detroit. The first question he asks is, "Where's Rosa?" Meaning Rosa Parks, because that had been a source of inspiration to him and his movement. So I think that we can see that these movements are closely related. And so it was actually one of the privileges of my life to go to India with many of these individuals, John Lewis, Harris Wofford, who was one of King's advisors, and of course later a U.S. Senator, Andrew Young, all of them went to India in 1959 to mark the 50th anniversary of King's trip there. And all of them had that opportunity to pay homage to the source of many of their insights. So I think that these two movements have been interlinked now for almost a century. And that's important to keep in mind as we take that further into the future.
Interesting. Rajmohan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, because if I heard Claiborne Carson clearly, did he mention that James Lawson has passed away?
No, I am so sorry. I was thinking of John Lewis.
John Lewis.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, thank God that.
Right. Yes, he was still, as you know, Rajmohan. He was at the conference last October, and I know that he'd be very disappointed that I prematurely.
I'm glad I was able to. Sorry, Anna. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks for the correction. I was thinking of John Lewis then.
Yeah. Okay.
And but he was certainly James Lawson. I think is a name that probably is not as familiar with as many of his students, but I think deserves an important role in this history.
Thank you for that. Glad he's still with us as well.
My God.
Yes, actually, we're trying to do a film. As you know, there's Michael Honey has done a wonderful film about his current, life, as because even at his age, or I should maybe say especially at his age, he is doing so much at the moment, and so we would like to do something that kind of pays our respects to his continuing role over the last, 70 years?
Wow. Well, Erica, I'd like to turn to you, if I may, and ask you about, the work that you've been doing statistically is just mind-blowing to me around showing the different movements over the last 100 years and what has evolved during that time. As far as encouraging us to continue, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and talk a little bit, if you can, about how movements today could be more effective. This is the direction I'd like us to all go in, is how can we make today's movements a little bit more effective?
Well, thank you for that question. And first, let me say it's such a delight and privilege for me to be serving on this panel with such incredible colleagues and inspirations. And congrats, Michael, on this film. And I also am very grateful to hear that my beloved mentor, James Lawson, is still with us as well. And for those viewers who aren't familiar with the Reverend Dr. James Lawson's life and work, I would recommend just Googling the eulogy he gave at John Lewis's funeral recently. There are many different wonderful resources, but he tells in a way his own story about how he was affected by Gandhi and how he organized and recruited people and mobilized an effective campaign in Nashville. On that basis, I also think, with regard to James Lawson, my first encounter with him will help to frame my answer to your question, Anna, which was I'd been doing some research trying to collect data on how many mass movements had existed around the world that were seeking similar outcomes that we usually associate with armed insurgency, like national liberation movements, anti-dictator movements, and such. And my colleague Maria Stefan and I had managed to put together a data set of about 323 such campaigns from 1900 to 2006 around the world that had at least 1,000 people participating and that were for these maximalist or system-changing goals. And we then categorized them into which of them relied primarily on the techniques that Gandhi was promoting and trying to help diffuse in his context and then worldwide, and those that relied primarily on the method of armed struggle. And then, of course, there are some that tried to combine the two. And it turned out that the nonviolent campaigns had been about twice as successful in achieving their territorial independence or the overthrow of the incumbent national leader during that time period compared to the violent campaigns. And in fact, that trend was increasing over time, so that we were starting to see more successes of nonviolent resistance over the latter part of the data set, especially since about the 1960s. And we were starting to see far fewer successes of armed struggle around the world. When I met Reverend Lawson, it was in the height of the Arab Spring. And we were both at a conference in the UK that was trying to make sense of what was happening with the Arab Spring. It just so happened that the book was coming out exactly at that time in 2011. And he said to me, I think that your research is really important and interesting. The statistics are wild and they're impressive and compelling, but you have to have a little faith too. And it was one of the most important things anybody's ever said to me as somebody who was encountering and trying to make sense of the empirical reality of our world that hadn't yet been fully excavated, but who also was, at that time, I was mostly interested in it as a matter of scientific interest and inquiry, as opposed to something that could help us to make sense of and motivate and inspire people to use a technique that is far more effective, but also far less destructive as a force in our world. So it turns out that these numbers aren't just interesting, they're also potentially fairly important, and they represent the spirit of humanity underway that I think Michael has tapped into and has been trying to capture and promote. Underlying these trends and these patterns is actually a vision for where we could go as a human family, and those are Jim's words, human family, that I often try to remember.
Wonderful. Wow. And that's the perfect segue over to Michael, because I'd love you to talk for a moment about the spiritual aspect of nonviolent movements and how that makes a difference. Why is that so important from a man who meditates 4 hours a day? Please share with us.
Okay. Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you for that beautiful segue, Erica. I used to give a talk called The State of the Art, in which I listed off 5 ways in which nonviolence has in fact evolved in the last maybe 30, 40 years. For one thing, new audiences, new participants have been brought in. Erica has much more to say on all of these. One of the most important is that nonviolent movements have begun to learn from one another in exactly the way that Clay was just talking about. I mean, I used to complain that even bank robbers did better debriefing after a heist than nonviolent campaigns often did, but that's not the case anymore. And we have Erica's work, and we have in the movements themselves, organizations like Canvas, which has shown up all over the world where insurrections are beginning to share pluses and minuses and, best practices. And now Nonviolent Peace Force has convened a meeting on each of the 6 inhabited continents to do exactly that. What are the best practices in unarmed civilian peacekeeping? But one of the things that I was hesitant to talk about then, and I'm really glad to bring it in now, is that while for Gandhi in India, there always was, stated or not, a spiritual dimension to what he was trying to promote and get his participants, his followers, to understand. And his distinction between nonviolence of the weak and nonviolence of the strong, you correct me if you think I'm wrong, Rajmohan, but was primarily a distinction between people who were simply carrying out nonviolence as a set of tools, often doing so provisionally. You know, if it doesn't work, we're going to go back to violence, which, as a colleague of mine in Santa Cruz says, people try nonviolence for a week, and when it doesn't work, they, quote unquote, they go back to violence, which hasn't worked for centuries. But here in the West, I think it's become more and more acceptable, interesting to look into what is that spiritual dimension. And so to give some sense of why I think it's important, and I am working my way around to your question, in the film, we emphasize this formula that was given to us by Barbara Deming, that nonviolence has two hands. One of the reasons that it's less destructive, as Erica was just saying, is that it does both. It says, I will not put up with your injustice, but at the same time, it says, I am open to you as a human being. And Rajmohan, you've also spoken to this. Now, to accomplish that openness to a human being who is humiliating you, who is threatening you with violence or carrying it out, it requires some kind of internal transformer, if you will. And both Gandhi and Martin Luther King spoke very eloquently about what you do with anger if you want to be a nonviolent person. Gandhi said this was the greatest lesson and the hardest that he ever learned, the lesson to control his anger. And Martin Luther King went a step further when he was challenged. I don't know, Clay, this may be in the letters from Birmingham jail, I'm not sure. He was challenged and people said to him, you are inciting anger and acts of violence. He said, we never aroused anger. The anger was already there. What we did was, and this is one of the most brilliant remarks among many, we expressed anger under discipline for maximum effect. And I can't help but think every day now, as I see what's going on, how critical that ability to transform, that willingness to see the other as a human being, would be in the movements that are going on right now. Of course, a lot of the violence that we're seeing in Black Lives Matter and other struggles are not caused by those participants, but by agents provocateur. But one of the things that I think a spiritual approach and practice enables us to do, it has two dimensions. One is cognitive and the other is emotional. The emotional one I just talked about, where you take that anger and you turn it into determination. You say, I will not stop until this injustice is history. But on the other hand, if you do this in a way that degrades the other person, then as Leroy Jones and others have said, you're degrading yourself. And as Gandhi said, no one can have an enemy until no one can look upon another as an enemy unless he has become his own enemy first. So that the spiritual dimension enables one to transform negative impulses in the mind, in the heart, into creative work, to put it very simply. The cognitive aspect is what Erica was just referring to, being able to see that we're all a human family, as Jim Lawson said, and that we are deeply interconnected. Now, one of the most interesting results of Erica's and Maria's research was that nonviolent movements lead to greater democracy, even when they fail. And that, in my view, is because using that method of nonviolence, including that component of being inclusive, to use the term that you just used, Raj, is an uplifting consciousness in general. As Martin Luther King used to say, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, because these things are a pervasive force. Well, knowing me, I better stop here, because I'm very eager to hear from the rest of you, and you really touched the right button there.
Good. Well, I'm curious how Raj would respond to that. Yes, please, Raj Mahan.
I appreciate very much what Michael has said, but I wanted to raise a connected point, which is a less optimistic point, which is that the world as a whole today is not offering a very good climate for, even for nonviolent movements. I'm not saying that nonviolent movements depend on a good climate, but nonetheless, let us recognize this, that when Gandhi was fighting, when Mandela was fighting, when MLK Jr. was fighting, there was media attention, the world wrote about it, the world discussed it. But in today's world, it's very difficult to mobilize world opinion in favor of movements against injustice, even if they are non-violent movements against injustice. To give only one example, 2 years ago in India, a remarkable man, former wonderful professor of civil engineering at one of the great IITs in India, he then was so unhappy about the pollution in what is regarded as the holy river Ganga, that he went on a fast against certain projects that he felt were polluting this river. He fasted for 110 days and then he died. And this greatly respected, much loved man, he put up this nonviolent fight. And the media and the authorities absolutely blacked out this news in India. Now, this is just one example. But today, when this ethno-nationalism and autocratic, anti-democratic, white nationalism here, Hindu nationalism there, Islamic nationalism elsewhere, some kind of tribal nationalism in the fourth place. But these strong ethnic nationalisms also attain a certain amount of popularity. And so it's very difficult for nonviolent movements to be able to mobilize attention in the world. And one other point, if I may just be allowed to mention this, that there was when the Hitlers and the Mussolinis of the world were around, the United States was there to put up a fight, and Britain was there, and other countries were there, where a fight could be waged. But today, when the anti-democratic movements in many countries are gathering strength, the United States, facing its own great challenges, seems to have no time or attention even to look at what's happening in the world. So when I think of this thought that has been expressed, which Dr. King expressed, which Gandhi expressed, which James Lawson has reiterated, the human family, are we thinking of humanity as a family, and are we willing to take up the world as our community? So this is a question that all those who want to work for, fight for nonviolence, they must confront.
Mm.
I'd like to follow up on that comment, because I think that one of the problems that we face is that, and it gets to Erica's research, is what is victory in our world? How do we? If, for example, I believe that one of the basic problems is that powerful nations have enormous power at their disposal to not necessarily defeat a movement in the sense of obliterating it, but simply not responding to it, and using other means to make it powerless. And I think that, you know, we kind of assume that people on the nonviolent side have learned lessons. You know, African Americans went to India, learned some lessons, brought them back to this country. But we often forget that Martin Luther King, in his broader vision, was a failure. You know, that he could not, you know, at the end of his life, he was more unpopular than he was 5 years earlier. And not even within the Black community, because when it came up to, you know, in a sense, what he was doing was mobilizing the nation state of the United States against the southern states. And he's mobilizing a more powerful force against a weaker force. And that's what decided and led to passage of civil rights legislation. But when he went to Chicago, or when he took on the Vietnam War, much less war in general, he had much less success. And so I think that we do face a real need for figuring out, and maybe this is what you were getting at, Raj Mohan, is, you know, what works in the 21st century when the power of media can be,
Yes.
you know, a movement can be silenced. A movement in a country like the Arab Spring. The crucial question was the federal government of the United States ultimately made it impossible for the Arab Spring to achieve most of its goals, because we were willing to support whoever comes out on top. And so it seems to me that particularly when a nonviolent movement anywhere, look at the Palestinian struggle. You know, as long as the United States supports Israel, the Palestinians don't have a chance. They could use all the nonviolence in the world, and they have, particularly in the last 10 years. But it doesn't seem to matter, because the objective is not possible under the current power relationships in the world. So I'm not saying that we should not be using it, but I think going toward the optimism that somehow, because this worked in certain situations in the past, in the 21st century, when it comes to governments have become more sophisticated also. They've learned lessons from the past. They've learned that sometimes the best approach to a nonviolent movement is not simply to crush it, although they do that too, but simply provide no means for it to garner outside pressure. And we're seeing this in a number of movements in the world right now.
Michael, it looked like you wanted to respond.
Yeah, if I could respond briefly. On the one hand, I can't deny for 1 second what you were saying, Rajmohan, about the atmosphere being more difficult for us to work in right now. Nor can I deny what you were saying, Clay, about the power of the nation state and the fact that nation states learn war right alongside with us. For example, Stephen Zunis always points out they deported Mubarak Awad when he was starting the first Intifada, but they knew the name and whereabouts of Sheikh Yassin and several other quite violent suicide bomber organizers, and didn't touch them because they knew that the nonviolence movement was more dangerous to them. But on the point that you raised, Raj, about the greater difficulty and the spread of totalitarian and authoritarian movements, there is nonetheless a phenomenon that as things get darker, people suffer more. Right now, last time I looked, Erica, you may know better, there was something like 20 American servicemen committing suicide every day. And this was absolutely unprecedented. The only explanation I can give for it is that as a human family, if you will, we are becoming more aware that violence is a harmful force that hurts the doer as well as those against whom it's perpetrated. And so because of this darkness, an enormous amount of suffering is being built up. And I have a feeling that if we could just, reach it somehow with the right message, that people would shift very quickly. That phenomenon has been seen individually and on a mass level of people shifting over very quickly.
Well, and I wonder, the film mentions the idea of that it's possible that our human nature is not necessarily about violence, that maybe we are actually more nonviolent in our human nature, in our basic human nature. And Erica, it made me wonder if there's anything that you've seen in the trends that you've been looking at that could speak to that.
Yeah, the data that I collect are highly aggregated. They look at mass campaigns within countries. And so it's hard to make kind of a generalizable claim about human nature. And as my colleagues were rightly saying, all of the outcomes that happen with nonviolent movements are highly contingent and conditional on the conditions in which those movements are operating, in part because they shape the strategies that the movements will use and sort of the playing field that they are beginning from. But I would say that one of the things I should mention is that in the last 10 years of data, it is clear that nonviolent campaigns have been declining in their success rates. And I think that it owes to a few of the things that Rajmohan and Clay were mentioning. The first of which is the effects of authoritarian learning, the effects of smarter, quote unquote, methods of repression that are more sophisticated and discriminating, thereby reducing the chance that they'll backfire politically against the regime, but also the nature of the co-optation and kind of monopolization of social media as a tool to divide and rule. I think there was a time, maybe 15 years ago, when the internet and social media more specifically gave an edge to activists and organizers that didn't have material physical space to coordinate and train, but that was quickly removed as an advantage and instead has become a major vulnerability for movements that are reliant on digital organizing because it's so easy to isolate groups so that they're not conversing with one another, reaching out and expanding and recruiting beyond a very small base of supporters. And even more dangerously, it gives them the illusion that they're popular and gaining in popularity when in fact they're just preaching to the choir, and there's a whole other reality in the same country that is different, and that's happening on another segment of kind of the information space. So we have this very deep level of polarization that also gives very much a false sense of optimism to people because they're talking amongst themselves on social media and basically overestimating their chances of political success. And I also think it's quite accurate to point out the limits of discrete success. So, to some extent, measuring movements as successful requires a judgment call about how you can compare hundreds and hundreds of movements across so many different domains. And so, using a discrete indicator like they removed an authoritarian government or they created independence is a way to compare the outcomes of nonviolent and violent movements. But, if you're just looking at what they achieve in the longer term, it does, if you compare nonviolent and violent campaigns side by side, nonviolent campaigns tend to lead to more kind of progressive and genuine improvements in livelihood and well-being in the society. but that doesn't, there's no guarantees, right? So just because people use nonviolent resistance or try to doesn't mean that they're going to win. And just because they win doesn't mean that in the long term, those gains are going to be consolidated. And so, I think, like I said, I can't really speak to the question about the human nature element of it. Although I will say, just from my own anecdotal experience, when I was a toddler, I quickly figured out ways to make my parents blindingly angry by just refusing to get up when they asked me to. And so I feel like that was an innate learned ability that, I think, and the movie, somebody says I think it's Bernard Lafayette who says, when you step out of the shower, you have everything you need to engage in nonviolent resistance. And, I feel like I was born with the capacity in a way that probably every person is born with the capacity to basically not cooperate, which is what it's about.
It is time for us to begin taking questions from the audience. So I'm going to start pushing these out to everybody. First question is from Marcia, and it's for Clayborn. What was Gandhi's answer when she asked him about the lynching?
Well, I think Raj Mohan would probably be better prepared to answer it. My memory of the conversation is that he suggested self-emulation. In other words, suicide, as one of the ways in which you could respond. And that I remember Sue Bailey was not encouraged by that. But I think that what he also followed with it, because someone else asked, well, how can you train people to use nonviolence? And he said, well, as Michael says, it takes a lot of training. You have to have a certain amount of confidence that the method is going to win. And Raj Mohan.
This meeting that Howard Thurman and Sue Bailey Thurman and others had with Gandhi in 1936 is a very important meeting. And as many of you may know, that is also the meeting where Gandhi expressed his thought, which was published at that time in 1936, that he felt that the African Americans would show nonviolence to the whole world. It's a prophetic statement that Gandhi made. But to Sue Bailey Thurman's important question about lynching, Gandhi's reply was, if my memory serves me right, was not so much that he recommended suicide. What he said was non-cooperation to the limit. Non-cooperation to the limit, even up to self-immolation. But the important point was that if a community refuses to cooperate with the oppressor, even with the lynching community, you non-cooperate with the lynching community, shame them, and then compel them. So this was his, yes, he did use the word.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Michael.
And it was, I'm just thinking of today. It would not be a totally satisfying answer, even with that correction. That I think you're very accurate in terms of remembering that conversation.
Michael, what were you going to add?
No, thank you. This is a very real question for me because I once failed to get peace studies installed at the University of California, Berkeley, because one of the deans who was grilling me said that, Gandhi, if a Japanese bomber were going over the ashram, he would simply look up in peace and love at that pilot, knowing that the pilot would not be aware. And isn't that absurd? So that set me thinking. And I came up with a model called the escalation curve, which basically states that the longer you wait in the development of hostility, the fewer options you have. You have to realize if a mob is coming after you, that you do not have time to engage in nonviolent persuasion. You do not have time to change the cultural atmosphere. The only thing that you can do is to, go kicking and screaming or to completely non-cooperate in some way that you can come up with. So I think the question that Sue Bailey asked was, of course, perfectly natural, and we are all interested in the answer, but it was a little bit, it needs to be contextualized. Nonviolence works well, and I think you'd agree with this, Erica, when it starts earlier. And you can't expect a sudden intervention of nonviolence after a conflict has built up to such an extreme level. You can't expect a dramatic turnaround.
Yeah, I would also say that that it is often the case when people are asking about the limits of nonviolent action, for the context to be presented in terms of an individual facing a number of people that want to hurt them, brutalize them, or kill them. And that is a scenario in which I think it would be very difficult to expect that a nonviolent action of one would produce the same type of dynamics that, say, outnumbering the mob by 1,000 to 1 margin would change the political dynamic. And so I think, when I talk about nonviolent resistance, I'm almost always referring to it with the scope condition that these are movements and collective action, rather than the sort of interpersonal confrontations, which I think is much more your area of expertise to a certain extent as well.
I would like to throw out another possibility of looking at this, and that is we sometimes concentrate on the power of nonviolent movements, and I think that that's obviously extremely important, but it seems like also something that can be done more generally, and especially in the 21st century, is looking at the question of the power of nation states. That, back when the Declaration of Independence talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what is the only institution that can take away your life, take away your liberty, and deny you opportunity, and get away with it on a regular basis? And it's basically because very little has been done on the other side of the equation. And it seems like that has to be part of any nonviolent campaign, is taking away those extreme weapons, and I think that's why it's so important in the present context that we're talking about police violence. Now, that in many nonviolent campaigns, one of the crucial questions becomes, how are the police going to behave? How are they going to, what are they going to allow? What are they going to put down? And one of the greatest political weapons that has been deployed in the United States and around the world is law and order politics. That you have a large number of people who want their peace and quiet, don't like their life disrupted by anything that is that they cannot respond to, and using that fear of disruption is one of the most powerful weapons that illegitimate states have. And when you look at Arab Spring, part of what was happening is that people who were not involved, their lives were being disrupted by massive demonstrations, especially in Cairo. And that became a vulnerability that is used by the government and used by the American government. And we might see, especially between now and the election, used by the American government to basically say, look, we're just imposing law and order. We're just stopping these disruptions and garnering support in that means, by that means.
I think it's incredibly interesting. I think we're getting some questions from the audience that are actually seeking some hope here, some positivity out of the conversation. We have a question from Anna asking, Martin Luther King talked about soul force, and in many of his speeches. Can panelists speak about this? And also, is nonviolence a skill to be practiced? And does this skill aid in that message of soul force in the nonviolence movements? Michael, it sounds like you.
Yeah, it's pretty much what I wanted to say anyway.
Great.
Yeah. I think both are correct. It is a force which is innate, as Erica so poignantly illustrated. But in order for that force to become an effective social changing element, it has to be trained and organized. And the reason that we have some of the violent institutions that you were just talking about, Clay, is that in a way people noticed their capacity to be violent and they decided to institutionalize it. And that's why in the film we stressed restorative justice on the one hand and unarmed civilian peacekeeping on the other hand, because these are institutionalizations of the opposite force, of nonviolence. And up to now, that side of the equation has been very much neglected. Yeah. So, yes, nonviolence is built on an innate capacity, but it is something that we need to recognize, which is very difficult to do in our Western culture and our prevailing worldview, and implement, develop.
And I wonder if quickly before we end, because we're getting very close here to the end of our time together, we just got a great question from Peter asking, in one sentence each, can the four of you speak to what is the single most important thing we can do to further the nonviolence movement and manifest a peaceful world?
I think be more aware of the global implications of what we do. I think that, that's the kind of education we need. In King's terms, to put it, how to live in the world house.
Rajvan?
Obey your conscience absolutely fearlessly and create solidarity across every single divide and regard the world as one family.
Michael?
Just beautiful, Rajvan. Thank you so much. If I had to compress it into one sentence, I would say, learn everything you can about nonviolence. That's where Erica and Maria's work and so many others starting to come in. And learn to recognize it within yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I would say popularize and internalize the knowledge that even though it doesn't always work, nonviolent resistance has worked far more than its detractors want you to know. And that scarcely no progressive change has ever happened without it.
Beautiful. Thank you all. Thank you for joining us here. I'm so grateful to each of you for taking the time to share with us your wisdom, your historic knowledge, your unique voice around the topic. And I think the audience, very grateful for you being here as well. And just want to say to you that I really recommend you dig into each one of these panelists' lives and look them up and Google them on YouTube and watch more, because there's so much that they've said that I have taken in such a hopeful message. I can't even tell you. And we didn't have enough time to get there, but it's truly within the messages that they bring. So thank you all for spending time with us. I'm now going to pass this back to Danette Wolpert, who's going to give us a few closing remarks from Illuminate. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks to each of you, Michael, Rajmahan, Erica, Clayborn, for your enlightening and thought-provoking insights. I feel like we could be here for another hour, because there is just so much to talk about and so much you have to share. But I think that we've launched a great conversation in many people's minds. And thanks, Anna, for guest hosting tonight's program. And finally, thanks to the almost 300 of you out there that have either joined us live today or are registered to watch the panel before the end of the window. So I wanted to close with one of my favorite quotes from Michael, actually. And here we go. The key leverage point for changing humanity from its disastrous course is the uplifting of the human image from that of a separate material fragment adrift in a meaningless universe to an evolving spiritual being, inseparable from others and the rest of creation. So poetic, Michael, and so wise. Thank you. This idea of the new story could not be more needed right now. So I'd like to call us all together and rise as a human family. Just a few closing announcements about how you can all continue your journey in nonviolence. First of all, I want to share that everybody who has purchased a ticket to the program will receive an email after the end of the window with a free nonviolence wallet card that you can place in your wallet, purse, pocket. And it's something to carry around with you to remind you of the central principles and how to practice it in your everyday life. And then if you're really, truly committed and want to go for a deep dive, then we have a really exciting opportunity for you. And that is the 30 Days of Nonviolence online course that is produced by the Meta Center. And this course is, I love the way this course is formatted. It's a very, it's both an introductory, but also very comprehensive 30 days of how to build the peace building power that lives within you. It'll help you make nonviolence a meaningful part of your everyday life. And I encourage you to sign up with all of your friends who have joined us tonight, and you can be accountable to each other on how well you do in 30 days to really create nonviolence within your relationships and in the greater world. We have a great special opportunity for you guys to get a 25% discount on that 30 Days of Nonviolence course. And that link is going to be provided to you both here in the chat and also on the panel page. That'll be available till Saturday. So jump on it now and make a commitment to yourself and the world. Lastly, this panel is available for replay until the end of the viewing window as well. So if you didn't catch everything that these brilliant panelists said, you have a chance to watch it again. And also, if you want to go dive deeper into the inner component of nonviolence that Michael's talking about, feel free to watch The Real Healing with Marianne Williamson and Michael, which is available also from the screening page. Finally, a couple of Illuminate related announcements. We have, observed quite a bit of division in our community, and even surprisingly, in our conscious community. And we've decided to host another panel towards the end of the month called Polarized. And in that panel, we will explain the divide in our conscious community, and we'll have a brain scientist with us as well. Lastly, if this is the type of content that you want to watch on a regular basis, and you're tired of the Hollywood shoot, shoot, bang, bang, and you're really seeking some consciousness expanding content, then I invite you to join the Illuminate family, the Illuminate community, through our membership, which you can explore at illuminatefilmfestival.com/membership. That's all, folks. Again, thanks to our wonderful panelists today, to our audience. Be well and see you next time.